A Timely Intervention by Dan Boylan. The doorbell jingled and stirred him from his collector's guide. He rose slowly and casually, hands behind his back, and strolled out of the office and into the shop. He was about to say, "Is there anything I can help you with, madam?" when she turned to him and said, "You know, I shall never cease to be impressed by the skill of those 19th century craftsmen. These," and she waved her hand at the walnut furniture, "are really quite superb." He beamed with a genuine appreciation and said, "There's a pair of matching fireside chairs in the window." "I know, it was those that tempted me in," she replied, lovingly caressing the smooth beeswax finish. He watched timidly from over the top of his half frames and tried to make an ex-bank manager's assessment. At the bank, he would have oozed self-confidence, but he was relatively new to the antiques game and still a little apprehensive. He noted that she was tastefully dressed, well-mannered, and seemed knowledgeable about antiques. A woman of high standing, a successful businesswoman perhaps. "I'll leave you to browse, madam. If there's anything you need, I'll—" "Well, yes," she said, and she took a small wooden box from her bag, offered it to him, and asked, "Would you be kind enough to have a look at this?" He carefully extracted the parcel, removed the wrapping, and placed a small silver clock on the tabletop. He peered intently at the ornate timepiece for several seconds before he dared breathe again. "It's a Louis XIV, he thought, as the waves of excitement sent a ripple of goosebumps down his spine. He screwed his jeweller's eyepiece into place and examined it in great detail. The silversmith's markings are right, along with the maker's name and the date. My God, one of these sold for over 30,000 last month. It's really quite magnificent, and his heart skipped a beat or two. "It's a Louis XIV, isn't it?" she called casually from over her shoulder, from the far side of the shop. "It's been in the family years. My husband thought we might refurbish it, sell it and refurbish the library." His mind swam in a sea of uncertainty. Does she fully realize what it's worth? Does she know the value of 19th century furniture? Is she so well off that she really doesn't care? Does she simply want to trade it for the inexpensive furniture? They never told him that antiques dealing could be quite as exciting as this. The soft trill of the telephone startled him, and he cursed silently, turned to face her and said, "Please excuse me for a second." He watched her moving between the narrow rows of furniture near the clock as he listened to someone inquiring if he'd had any Regency style items in stock. He dispensed with them, the caller quickly, and was back in front of the table in under a minute. "It's a superb piece," he felt he had to concede. "I haven't seen one like it for ages." "There is a certificate of ownership, I assume?" "Naturally," she replied, and he smiled weakly at his lack of tact and trust. His mind reeled in uncertainty, and his confidence floundered. A brittle silence hung in the air, and he fidgeted, coughed, and wrung his hands as he fought to make a decision. Eventually she broke the ice and asked, "What would you say, Mr. Harris?" "Oh, it is Mr. Harris, isn't it?" "Oh, how rude of me. I'm Anne Barrington Cox. I live at Gables Court, near Botley." And she thrust her hand forward. "What would you say, Mr. Harris, if I were to suggest a straight trade? I take the 2 walnut cabinets, the bureau, the matching fireside chairs, and the 2 rather nice Peterson watercolors in the window, and you take the clock." He looked at her momentarily, and he put his hands to his mouth to conceal his surprise at her extremely attractive bargain. "Oh, give me a second, would you please?" and began to scribble figures on a scrap of paper. He knew that the clock was 3 times the value of the furniture, and it would sell within a week. He was about to agree when she said, in a voice soft and appealing, "Look, I'm being rather greedy, aren't I? Forget the watercolors. I'll just take the furniture, and you take the clock." He took a deep breath and swallowed a little apprehensively, thrust back his shoulders, held out his hand and announced, "I do believe that we have a deal, Mrs. Barrington Cox." They beamed at each other with a deep satisfaction. "Oh, super!" she exclaimed. "Now there's a removals man here in town that I often use. Perhaps I could telephone him from your office, and while you complete the sale." She stood behind the desk and dialed the number, spoke briefly, and held her hand over the mouthpiece and said, "He can come immediately, if that's all right with you." He nodded, but his mind was engaged in the beauty of the symbol of the tiny timepiece. She went back to browsing, whilst he impatiently shuffled some papers about and waited for the removals man. The once stuffy atmosphere was now crisp and vibrant, with a whiff of mutual satisfaction and success. The door opened with a jingle, and Harris looked to see a man in a brown coat walking towards him. He stood and was about to give instructions on loading the furniture when the tall, gaunt newcomer formally asked, "Are you Peter Harris?" Slightly shaken, Harris looked up to see not a removal man, but a balding, shallow-faced man holding a warrant card. "Detective Sergeant Fraser, City Police. I'm investigating the theft of some period diamond jewellery. Have you been offered any quality stuff recently, sir?" Harris pursed his lips, and Mrs. Barrington Cox moved quietly away to the front of the shop. "No, nothing, Sergeant." His voice abrupt and edgy. "Can I leave you with a description of the stolen stuff, sir? They might get round to you later." "Oh, very well, he snapped impatiently, his mind more on the pending transaction than stolen jewellery. "Leave it here, and I'll have a look at it later." The policeman looked at him sharply and noticed a sudden tick in the dealer's left eye and a bead of sweat on his brow. He stared at Harris for several seconds, perhaps wondering why the elderly antiques dealer should be so brusque and touchy. He then glanced slowly and suspiciously around the shop as if making an investigative assessment, and his eyes eventually settled on the clock, still sitting in the centre of the table. He glanced at Harris again, and then at Mrs. Barrington Cox, and a broad, impish grin spread slowly across his tired, shallow face. "You're new to the antiques game, aren't you, Harris?" he said without respect. Yes, why?" Harris replied sharply. "Why? Because I've just saved you an awful lot of money, that's why." "Now, just what's going on here?" demanded Harris. The detective ignored him and approached the clock, slowly peering to his left and right. Then he stopped, bent his knees, and stretched his arm into a gap between two small cabinets. "Voilà, mes enfants, chronometer number 2, he announced in appalling French, and gently placed an identical clock alongside the original. The dealer's eyes opened wide with amazement. His jaws dropped and he was lost for words. "Firstly, the real McCoy, to tempt your appetite," said the detective. "Then, bosh, while you're distracted, the switch. Then, poof, you lose some of your best stock, the original clock is recovered, and you're left with a cheap replica. It's the oldest trick in the book." And then he turned to face her. "Isn't it, Molly?" He grinned broadly at her and said in a faint sympathy, "Just not your day, old girl, is it? Another few minutes and all his best stock would have been loaded onto a truck and on its way up the M3 to a waiting buyer. Perhaps you're losing your touch, old girl. What a shame." And he moved quickly, snapped a pair of cuffs on her, and phoned his HQ on his mobile phone and requested a squad car. Then placed the clocks in a cardboard box and jotted down some details in his notebook. As the squad car pulled away, Harris lifted the phone. "Hello, love, it's me." No, been a quiet day, really," he sighed. "Then, half an hour ago, this woman came in and tried to pull the old 2 clocks trick. I was onto her straight away, and I'd switched the clocks around and negotiated a deal with that cheap reproduction furniture. Then a copper came in and spoiled it. I'll be home in half an hour. I was going to pick up a nice bottle of champagne to celebrate, but now it'll just have to be a bottle of cheap plonk."